The creepy cold case of the Villisca Axe Murder. On a quiet summer night in 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, was shattered by an act so brutal that it would haunt generations. 8 people, 2 adults and 6 children, were found bludgeoned to death in their own home. Over a century later, no one has ever been convicted. But the chilling evidence, whispers of cover-ups, and a long list of suspects have kept this case ice-cold and terrifyingly open. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, grab a cup of coffee. As we unveil what's happening in the dark, let's dive right into it. Before June 10, 1912, Villisca was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, and locking doors was almost considered an insult to your neighbors. The Moore family, Josiah and Sarah, along with their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were well-liked and involved in the community. That Sunday had been particularly joyful. The family attended a church service, and the 2 Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina, joined them for a sleepover. By Monday morning, the silence inside the Moore residence at 508 East 2nd Street was deafening. It was a neighbor, Mary Peckham, who first noticed something was off. When no one answered the door, she called Josiah's brother. What they discovered inside was beyond comprehension. Inside, all 8 members were dead, killed as they slept, most by multiple blows to the head with an axe. The blade left in the guest room beside Lena and Ina's bodies. The killer had draped clothing over mirrors and windows, covered the victims' faces, and bizarrely, had cooked a plate of food, left untouched on the table. Lena Stillinger's body suggested a struggle. Her nightgown was pushed up, and she had a defensive wound. Yet no evidence of sexual assault was found, only the unsettling implication that the killer had stayed in the house for hours after the murders. Word spread fast. Crowds gathered. The crime scene, unfortunately, became contaminated. Dozens wandered through the house, stepping over blood, touching furniture, some even picking up the axe. Vital evidence was lost forever. The first suspect was Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and state senator. Josiah Moore had once worked for him, but left to start his own business, a move that sparked long-standing tension. Rumors suggested that Jones hired a drifter, William Blackie Mansfield, to carry out the murders. Mansfield had been suspected in similar axe murders in other states. But Jones wasn't the only suspect. Then came Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a history of mental illness and voyeuristic tendencies. He was in Villisca the night of the murders, even attended the church event the Moores had gone to. Oddly, he left town abruptly early the next morning. Later, Kelly confessed, then recanted. He was tried twice. The first jury hung, the second acquitted him. And then there was Andy Sawyer, a drifter obsessed with axes. Railroad workers claimed he spoke about the murders before news had broken publicly. But there was never enough evidence to hold him. Every suspect had a motive. Every alibi had holes. But every lead led nowhere. Years passed, then decades. The Moore house remained, first abandoned, later restored as a macabre tourist attraction. Some claimed it was haunted. Paranormal investigators flocked to it. Strange voices were recorded. Items moved on their own. Visitors complained of nausea, sudden cold drafts, or a presence watching them. But the most chilling tales came from the children. A local girl who toured the house in the early 2000s said she saw a boy standing at the top of the stairs, axe in hand. He didn't blink, she said, just stared. But no one else had seen him. Was it grief that stained the house? Or something darker, something left behind by whoever did this? In 2014, a group of amateur sleuths decided to dig deeper. One of them, James Callahan, was a retired FBI analyst. He combed through historical records, eyewitness accounts, and old police files. What he found sent chills down his spine. A torn journal page found in the original police box, yellowed and nearly illegible, included a name never publicly released before, Dr. E.C. Hoff. Hoff had been a local doctor, the first on scene to examine the bodies. His notes mentioned something police never followed up on. A bloody footprint near the back door, far smaller than a man's, possibly a child's. Had someone been helping the killer? Or had a child witnessed the entire thing and been silenced? In 2017, a new owner of the Villisca Axe Murder house began renovations and found something strange under the floorboards of the guest room. A child's marble, stained red. Experts later determined it was coated in dried blood over 100 years old. But whose blood? DNA tests were inconclusive, degraded from time. The house gave up a piece of history, but not the truth. As the case stands, over 110 years later, no one has ever been held accountable. Families of the victims passed away long ago, but some believe justice is still possible. The evidence might be buried in forgotten files. Or perhaps, it's hidden in plain sight, like a name carved into the wooden frame of a door upstairs. Recently discovered, GK 1912. Could it have been him all along? In 2023, a box of forgotten court records was uncovered in a Des Moines archive. Inside it, a sealed envelope marked Private Testimony, Do Not Release. Inside was a confession dated July 1914. The signature had faded, but the words hadn't. And what it claimed changes everything. The old Moore house in Villisca stood frozen in time, like a monument to terror. After the brutal axe murders of 1912, generations passed, but the questions never did. Who slaughtered 8 innocent people in their sleep? Why did the killer vanish without a trace? And most chilling of all, was the murderer ever even human? By the time local historian Darla Henson moved back to her hometown in the early 2000s, the Moore house had become a tourist curiosity. Daytime ghost tours, overnight stays, and haunted tales turned tragedy into twisted entertainment. But for Darla, the house wasn't just a relic. It was a puzzle that had haunted her since childhood. Her grandmother, now in her 80s, had been just a little girl when the murders happened. She used to whisper things at night. Strange memories, half-truths, and vivid dreams she claimed were real. Darla remembered her saying once, "The killer never left the house. It feeds off being remembered." Dismissed as senile rambling back then, those words came rushing back the night Darla stayed overnight in the Moore home with a small group of paranormal investigators. At first, the night seemed like any other. EVP recorders buzzed with static. EMF meters blinked softly. But around 3:15 a.m., the same hour the Moore family was believed to have been murdered over 90 years earlier, everything changed. The lights flickered. Cold air swept the second floor like an invisible breath. One of the investigators, a man named Jason Burke, froze in place. He stared at the small children's bedroom, eyes wide in terror. "Someone just walked across the room," he said. "Right behind the bed." Darla's heart pounded. "We're all up here," she replied. "No one's down there." Jason lifted his phone to record. What they captured was horrifying. Faint footsteps on the hardwood floor, then the distinct creak of a floorboard, followed by what sounded like a low growl. The group fled the house before sunrise, shaken to the core. But Darla stayed behind. Something had changed inside her. This wasn't just history, it was unfinished business. She dove into the case again. Theories abounded. Was it the jealous ex-lover of Lena Stillinger, one of the 2 girls staying the night? Was it Reverend George Kelly, the traveling preacher with a history of mental illness and a morbid fascination with the case? Or had someone in town known far more than they ever let on? While sifting through dusty court documents at the Montgomery County Records Office, Darla found something remarkable. A 1917 confession from George Kelly that had never been made public. It had been dismissed as inadmissible due to coercion, but the details were chilling. In it, Kelly wrote, "They were so still when I entered. I didn't want to do it, but the voices insisted. They told me to silence the house." But there was something odd about the statement. Kelly, a known eccentric, described the house in detail, but incorrectly. He mentioned a winding staircase and a stone fireplace, features that never existed in the Moore home. Had he been imagining it? Or was he confessing to a different crime entirely? Darla's gut told her the killer hadn't been caught. And as she kept digging, she found one overlooked clue in the coroner's original 1912 report. Each mirror in the Moore house had been covered with cloth. Every single one. That detail hadn't been part of the official public record. Yet, It was a ritual seen in some old folk traditions. In rural parts of Europe, families would cover mirrors after death to prevent spirits from getting trapped inside. But why would the killer do it? Unless they believed the souls of the victims could expose them. In the summer of 2005, Darla tracked down a distant descendant of the Moore family who had inherited an old chest of heirlooms. Among the yellowed photos and broken trinkets was a tattered leather diary belonging to Sarah Moore, the matriarch of the murdered family. What she read sent chills down her spine. June 4th, 1912. Josiah's been having nightmares again. Says a man with no face watches us from the barn. The children laugh, but I see something in his eyes. I fear he's not dreaming. June 6th, 1912. It stood by the foot of our bed last night. Tall, silent. I couldn't move. Josiah says I imagined it, but I don't believe I did. June 9th, 1912. We heard footsteps in the attic. Josiah went to check, found nothing. But I know it was there. I feel it watching. These entries were written just days before the murder. Had Sarah Moore seen the killer before it happened? Or was there something darker in that house? Digging deeper, Darla discovered that between 1911 and 1912, at least 7 other families across the Midwest had been murdered in their sleep, always with an axe, always at night, always near train tracks. In each case, mirrors were covered. Food was left on the table. The killer never stole anything. And most chilling of all, no neighbors heard a sound. Authorities at the time had suspected a transient serial killer using trains to travel town to town. But no one was ever arrested. One case in Kansas bore an uncanny resemblance. The town's name? Ellsworth. There, the killer had left behind a note carved into the barn wall. When you see me, don't scream. That's how they know where you are. Darla believed the Villisca case was connected, but something didn't add up. Why had the killings suddenly stopped after 1912? Did the killer die? Get caught for another crime? Or was there a different reason? Her obsession deepened. She began waking in the middle of the night, hearing faint creaks in her own home. Doors she knew she'd locked were found ajar. And once, on a rainy afternoon, she swore she saw muddy footprints trailing into her hallway. Footprints that vanished halfway through. She wasn't just studying the case anymore. She was living it. Darla returned to the Moore house one final time, alone. Determined to uncover something she had missed, she crawled into the small attic crawlspace where the killer was believed to have hidden for hours before the murders. And there, wedged behind a beam, she found it. A child's hair ribbon. It wasn't covered in dust. It wasn't old. It looked new. She froze. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. The front door slammed shut. Every light flickered out. Her flashlight died, and in the pitch black of that crawlspace, Darla heard a whisper, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably close. June 1912. 8 people, including 6 children, were brutally slaughtered in their beds in Villisca, Iowa. The murderer used an axe but was never caught. Over a century later, the case still haunts the town, and some say the house still holds its secrets. In part 2, we uncovered a disturbing connection between a traveling preacher and a string of similar axe murders. But what happened next would shake the investigation to its core. In 1913, 1 year after the Villisca massacre, investigators noticed something strange. Similar murders had been occurring in towns along the same rail line. In Kansas, Colorado, Illinois, even as far as Louisiana, families were being murdered in their sleep, always with the blunt side of an axe. Curtains drawn, mirrors covered, lamps with the chimney glass removed to dim the light. The killer moved like a ghost. He killed, vanished, and struck again somewhere else. The similarities were too precise to ignore. The man dubbed the Midnight Axeman wasn't just a local threat. He was mobile and he was methodical. Villisca wasn't his only stop. It was part of a terrifying pattern. Decades later, a retired FBI profiler named Bill James and his daughter Rachel began researching these crimes. What they found was bone-chilling. Using patterns from historical police reports and old newspaper archives, they traced over 30 similar murders. At the heart of their theory was a suspect named Paul Mueller, a German immigrant who had once worked as a farmhand in Massachusetts. He was suspected in a brutal 1897 family murder there, but vanished before he could be questioned. From there, the trail of bodies followed a westward path, each murder echoing the same gruesome methods used in Villisca. Mueller's connection to railroads, his solitary nature, and his likely mental illness made him a chillingly plausible suspect. But Mueller was never found. No fingerprints, no direct evidence, just the eerily consistent trail of horror he may have left behind. In the present day, the Moore House in Villisca is a tourist attraction. People come from all over to see the scene of the crime. But some come not for history but for the unexplained. Several paranormal investigators have claimed to hear children's voices, unseen footsteps, and even blood-curdling screams during overnight stays. In one documented event, a visitor woke up with a scratch down her back. Another claimed to see a man with an axe standing at the foot of her bed before he vanished into thin air. While skeptics dismiss the house as an overhyped tourist trap, others believe the energy left behind by the brutal crime still lingers in the wood, in the air, and in the silence. In 2021, a group of graduate students from the University of Iowa began re-examining the evidence. Using digital enhancement on old photos and retyped court testimonies, they made a discovery that hadn't been noticed before. A signature, a faint carving on the back of the Moore family's bedroom door, partially hidden under layers of paint, was uncovered under UV light. The initials PM. Could it be Paul Mueller? The carving matched one found in an abandoned home in Colorado, another axe murder scene from 1911. The story was suddenly thrust back into the national spotlight. Then came a shocking revelation from a 102-year-old woman named Evelyn Marks, living in a nursing home in Kansas. Her father had worked on the railroad in the 1910s. As a little girl, she remembered a strange man who stayed at their boarding house briefly. He kept to himself, always wore gloves, and avoided talking to anyone. One night, she said she heard him muttering in German through the walls. The next morning, he was gone, and days later, the town learned of a nearby family's gruesome death. Evelyn never forgot his face or his name, Mueller. A composite sketch was created based on her description. When compared to a 1900s wanted poster, the resemblance was uncanny. Despite the new leads, the case remains officially unsolved. For the descendants of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls, the pain remains. Over the years, Villisca tried to move on, but the shadow of that night still clings to its history. Locals say the tragedy changed the town forever. Children weren't allowed to sleep over at friends' homes. Families began locking their doors. Fear, once a stranger, took up permanent residence. The crime also reshaped how authorities handled mass murders, though rural police forces at the time were ill-equipped for such terror. Justice was never served. Not for Josiah and Sarah Moore. Not for their 4 children. Not for Lena and Ina Stillinger. But that doesn't mean the story ends there. Because just when we thought we knew everything, just when we believed Mueller might have been the monster behind the axe, inside it were chilling entries written in shaky, nervous handwriting. Descriptions of dreams, of blood, of a house with creaking floors and 8 quiet souls. And at the bottom of the final entry, a different name, one never mentioned before. So who really committed the Villisca Axe murders? Was it Paul Mueller? Or someone closer to the victims than anyone dared imagine? Tell me what you think in the comments section below. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button for more chilling true crime stories and crimes you never imagined.